Good afternoon. Thank you to those who are joining this webinar on today. We are pleased that you are with us. This is the second half of our Trauma Symposium, where we are taking a look at disaster preparedness, response, and recovery for the long haul today. We are thankful to McCormick Theological Seminary and the Presbytery of Chicago, who in partnership have convened trauma symposiums that are informed, practical, and spiritually engaged. And so we're thrilled to have you with us today. You will be able to utilize the chat function and the Q&A functions to share your comments and your questions throughout. My name is Reverend Dr. Barbara Wilson. I am the Director of Collaboration and Community Partnerships with Chicago Presbytery. That is a mid-council of the Presbyterian Church USA. And in this geographic region, there are about 84 Presbyterian congregations. I am also pleased to be ordained as an African Methodist Episcopal clergy person, and a double alum of McCormick Theological Seminary, in this partnership. And so we are so grateful to be working with my co-convener, the Reverend Dr. Stephanie Crumpton, who is Associate Professor of Practical Theology. And we will be beginning in about 2 minutes, so welcome. And we shall continue on. Stephanie, would you like to give any words of greetings at this moment?
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Barbara Wilson. It's always good to be here with you as well as our co-panelists. Thank you also for those who have been journeying with us since April. There are quite a few folks who have started with us in April, May, and now we're in June heading into July. So we thank you so much for your interest and your investment in being learning partners, teaching and learning partners along this work. It takes an entire collective for us to move this work forward. And we're really grateful that folks have shown an interest and continue to show an interest. So I think that's it. Today I get to switch seats a little bit with my co-convener, Reverend Dr. Barbara Wilson. This time I'll be presenting again as I did last time. So you all will hear mostly from Reverend Dr. Barbara on the front end, and then I'll come in towards the end with a piece kind of examining some questions about faith and long haul relationships with self and other. How do you work that out in the middle of a traumatic, I wanted to say right then traumatic experience, but we should probably call it traumatic season. So yeah, that's it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And please, for both of our panelists, whom I will introduce momentarily, call me Barbara. We are so thrilled that you are with us today, not only because of the season of pandemics that we are in, but also because the pandemics are on top of everything we are living with and navigating. And so this is a space that we call a brave, courageous space for us to learn together as we consider the science and the neuroscience and the education of the topic of trauma, as we take a look at practical models that we can take what we learn and implement on the ground together, and then also that we connect all of this concern to our spiritual understanding. And so we endeavor that these experiences are also spiritually engaged. With that, again, welcome to this webinar for today, where we are taking a look at disaster preparedness for the long haul. And if there are organizers with us today, you've heard that language before. In the interest of faith rootedness, to live and navigate in the world is not only for a season, but it's for the long haul. So we are pleased to welcome Dr. Zachary Moon, who is the Associate Professor of Practical Theology at Chicago Theological Seminary. Zachary was with us at the immediate past webinar, and he's with us again today. We also will welcome Dorian Ortega, and she is a licensed clinical professional counselor, and she's the founder of Fly Radical Therapy. Makes you want to contact her and see what services she offers. fly, radical therapy. So, Dorian, we're going to have a conversation after today's webinar, absolutely. And then, of course, bringing up the spiritual piece, the third presenter is our own Reverend Dr. Stephanie Crumpton, the Associate Professor of Practical Theology at McCormick Theological Seminary. With that, we invite you to breathe deeply, and as we prepare to learn, to listen deeply, and then to see how we might move forward together. We thank you for those who have been with us before and for surveys that have been completed. Hopefully you've been receiving an email survey to give us your feedback. If not, you will. And with that, we would like to present Dr. Zachary to share with us. Zach?
Thank you so much, Barbara. So I'm going to take us back a little bit here in the time machine and just kind of pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago. We had a graphic here, and I'll just ask maybe Barbara or Stephanie, can you help to enable my screen sharing so that I can just bring that that visual up for us. But this was a visual that describes and kind of outlines what it looks like when a disaster is taking place. So let me pull that up for us. Okay, so I'm hoping you all are seeing this with me here. And if you were with us 2 weeks ago on June the 4th, we spent some time kind of unpacking this and really kind of talking about the different elements that are involved here. So this will be a little bit of review for those folks and hopefully catching up some folks who are able to join us today for the first time. But what you see in this chart, and like any two-dimensional chart, right, there's something about it that's a little bit of a simplification in terms of how these dynamics work, but meant to be kind of an exercise in acknowledging certain elements of what's taking place here. And this is a graphic that's developed to think about what happens in the instance of a disaster. But the disaster really that's on the mind of the folks who are putting this together is something more like a hurricane or a tornado, something that you can see coming, right? There's a pre-disaster time. There's a time where the disaster is happening, and then there's a time of reconstruction and recovery after that. Now, if y'all are thinking about some of the disasters we've been contending with over these last few months, the pandemic maybe being the largest, but certainly some others as well. One of the things that's very challenging is the question of time, right? What time is it when we're talking about the pandemic? Are we still kind of in the midst of the disaster? Have we seen the end of the first wave of the pandemic, or in fact, are we more or less kind of riding this plateau and we haven't really seen the decline? Here in the state of Illinois, I think we're benefiting from some improved numbers when it comes to some of the diagnosis rate and some of the death rate, but certainly nationwide, we're seeing this continuing to really be a persistent issue. So let me just walk us again quickly through this. Here, the kind of first phase would be a kind of pre-disaster time, a time where there's some sense of warning and threat. People are kind of bracing and getting ready for what this disaster would be. You have that impact moment, again, thinking if this was an acute disaster like a hurricane coming ashore or a tornado taking place, you know, that might happen over, you know, a period of hours or days at most. With the pandemic, the impact has been much longer than that. And what that gives rise to is what's sometimes called the heroic phase. It's a time of really intense energy. People are out there doing what needs to be done, right? We're acknowledging our first responders, our essential workers, the folks who are out there. And even during that time, those of us who have needed to shelter in place are also doing our part, right? That's a maybe less celebrated kind of heroism in this time, but also necessary for those of us to shelter in place. So some things are happening there, and the energy there is what we would think of kind of biochemically as being like adrenaline, right? There's just a lot of that kind of high, intense energy that's taking place during that time. But that time doesn't last forever. And usually there is some kind of peak of what happens there, which is called the honeymoon, although it's not always all that romantic. But often doesn't last very long, right? And so what happens there on the back end is a kind of decline into a time of disillusionment, sometimes despair. Feelings of isolation and alienation can take place during that time. And then, of course, there's this time of reconstruction. One of the things that feels important to acknowledge again, that I hope you all heard me if you were with us 2 weeks ago, is that reconstruction phase doesn't always happen. And so I think one of the places our conversation today may go is, what does it take to actually do the necessary work in that phase, so that in fact our future is better than our past and better than our present. That's necessary for us to really do the work that takes place there. So having walked through that quickly, hopefully that's just kind of reorienting us to some of the ideas of what's taking place. I did just want to highlight a couple of additional pieces here that I want us to be thinking about, particularly because I think I want us to be thinking about disasters plural, because we're not just talking about the pandemic. Over these weeks, maybe we've been talking even more about what's been happening with the uprisings in response to the most recent police brutality. And there's also some ways in which movements for justice also follow almost identically this exact same trajectory. So I just want to kind of quickly map that for us as well. And again, this map can work for a particular kind of movement event, like a protest, but it can also sort of help to sketch out a little bit of what happens with a larger movement as well. So when we think about what's happened over here in these last few weeks, what is being activated, in fact, is not anything new, right? So before George Floyd is killed by these police officers, there is already a sense of warning. There is already a sense of threat in any community who's paying attention to what's going on with surveillance and policing and state power in this nation and in the history of this nation. So it's not like we start from nothing and then it just escalates, right? The folks who are paying attention, as James Baldwin wants to remind us, right? Folks who are paying attention are already angry, right? Baldwin said, if you're Black and you're conscious, you're angry all the time, right? And I think that the same can be said for any bodies who are paying attention to what's going on and recognize the precarity, particularly of Black bodies and brown bodies in the circumstances of this nation. So it's not like we start from zero. There's already things that are happening there. And if we're gonna have a trauma-informed kind of understanding of what's going on with people, we better recognize that people they bring with themselves a trauma history. And it's not just their own story. I was born on this date. Here's the things that's happened to me since that time. For me, I'm committed to us thinking, whether it's through, some of the language of epigenetics, to think about transgenerational trauma. I think I can't state this more clearly. I was actually having this conversation with my in-laws just a couple of days ago, as we were talking about the ways that families continue to be vessels of traumatic experience that's taken place generations before. Sometimes those are traumas that we know about, maybe in our most immediate family, but I think there are traumas that inscribe our very DNA. This is what epigenetics help us to understand, our very DNA, whether or not we know consciously about that trauma or not, our bodies know this trauma. And so if we're talking about Black folks in the United States, we're talking about generations and generations of racialized violence that has traumatized Black bodies before any of the folks that we know, that we love in this lifetime. Those bodies have already been impacted by the way that violence has been used to subjugate, as I say, particularly Black and brown bodies in this national context. So when we talk about pre-disaster, again, we're not talking about everybody starts from equal. We're talking about everybody who's here today is a survivor of some trauma. And again, sometimes those are traumas that we know very clearly, that maybe we're already working on and we're very conscientious in recognizing, but those may be traumas that in fact deeply inform who we are and how we inhabit this world that we don't even have language for. We don't even exactly understand how powerful they are, or why they're so powerful in our life. So I particularly want to name that on the front end, because sometimes I think we imagine that, well, I'm just the protagonist of my own story, so everything must start with me, and this is just how it's going to be. We go to see the movies, and it seems like the movie suggests that, right? Well, here it says heroic, right? So I'm looking for some heroes. The story is longer than that. The story begins long before us. One of the things I really appreciate about what Dr. Crumpton shared 2 weeks ago was talking about some of the intergenerational relationships that have shaped and influenced who she is and the kind of work that she's doing now. I think it's important for us to keep that in view for ourselves as well, as we think about this. So the impact of what happens when, once again, our nation becomes kind of broadly aware of what's happening with police violence, particularly police violence against Black bodies, that would serve as this kind of impact moment. And what happens again in the aftermath of that is this kind of charging of energy. And again, the way that energy comes about is going to happen differently for different bodies, right? And so as we're thinking about what does it mean to care for people, what does it mean to care for ourselves in the midst of this, always appreciate that what's happening in that heroic phase is going to look differently for every single person. Why? Well, in large part because of the trauma stories that have inscribed their body before now, right? So again, we don't start on a neutral playing field here. Our lives have already been shaped and influenced before this time. So when we start feeling the intensity of that energy, that may take us in some different directions, right? I think most commonly in situations like this, white folks start feeling kind of anxious. Maybe they start feeling some guilt or some shame, saying, I didn't realize this was such an issue. I wasn't aware of this, or I need to do this, or I need to do that. There's a little bit of kind of frantic thing that's happening for a lot of white folks in this last couple of weeks. Whereas you start listening to Black folks are saying, we know all about this. There's nothing new about this. What's devastating about this is a continuation of a legacy of policing and of violence against the Black community that in fact has been going on for years and for generations. So this is how this kind of heroic energy can take on very different manifestations for different bodies and for different communities along the way as well. When we think about movements then, though, we have to be very conscientious, because there's a way in which this heroic phase, and we're very much in this heroic phase in this moment, in the aftermath of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other these other recent instances of violence. And everybody's, many folks are feeling a sense of hopefulness, or at least a curiosity that maybe something's going to happen a little bit different, right? Some folks who don't usually issue public statements are issuing public statements. Folks are talking about, is Colin Kaepernick going to get a tryout in the NFL again, right? There's some things that didn't seem possible even 6 months ago that now are being talked about, right? So there's some kind of hopefulness there. There's some anticipatory frustration when that hopefulness isn't there. Maybe this isn't going to work out. Maybe there's going to be yet another backslide that's happened so many times in our history, right? You have all that energy is kind of taking place there. But this is also a time where folks feel, I don't know how to say this any differently, but it's like we're awake a little bit more than usual. And there's something very intoxicating about that. And so my caution to all of us is, this phase isn't going to last forever. And the question is going to be, how are we going to care for ourselves? How are we going to care for our people, our communities, our cities? As we start moving into that disillusionment, that despair kind of phase. Because oftentimes what happens is, people feel that heroic energy. They're out in the streets protesting. They think one thing is going to happen. It either happens or it doesn't happen. But as things stop being in that heroic phase, people start feeling some deep despair, maybe some sense of betrayal. I thought something was going to happen and it didn't end up happening that way. I felt a kind of togetherness with other people who care about the things that I care about when I was out there in the street. There's something very powerful about being out there with people you've never met before, and yet you're having a sense of community, togetherness, cohesion, maybe to a degree a kind of trauma bonding, but we'll hold that conversation maybe till we have some more time. But there is a sense of coherency that is glimpsed in those protest moments that doesn't last forever. And so when we don't acknowledge that and we don't recognize that, it's very easy to then say, well, folks aren't showing up at the vigils anymore. They're not showing up at the protest anymore. It feels like folks are not committed. It feels like this community that was seeking justice isn't awake like it used to be awake. And it's altogether natural for people to feel betrayed by that, to feel angry about that. And I think that's something we got to be on the lookout for. And so I just want to finish up this review and hopefully kind of adding some content here by talking a little bit about what's named here as a reconstruction or a recovery phase. It's crucially important, particularly if we're working with community organizations and communities of faith, that we recognize that we actually have to be about this phase of work 24/7, right? So we can say, okay, let's look ahead. Let's think about public health. Let's think about this pandemic. What do we need to be doing right now so that if there's a second wave or if there's another pandemic, we might be saying to ourselves, how do we need to be doing church differently given what's happening with these movements in the street? What does it look like for churches to be allied with these uprisings, these quests and demands for justice in terms of what's happening right now? But churches, y'all, we got to be about this work all the time. So if y'all are feeling some good energy around this right now, if you're seeing people in the congregation who are leaning into this in a different way, seize on that. Be opportunistic, right? But also remember, one of the things that we need our institutions to be able to do is, as persistently and consistently as possible, we got to be about this work. We got to be thinking about how the way in which we organize community has very significant ramifications for how we're living our lives. That to the extent that the church is able to be authentically and dynamically faithful in this world, in this context, in this place, at this moment in time, that is significant. And so we got to always be doing that work. And guess what? We're always working with people who got trauma stories. We always are, hopefully we're always in relationship with the work of justice in some kind of way. So even as we see the ways in which these past weeks and these past months have been different in some ways, I just immediately just want to emphasize churches always need to be about this work. They always need to be thinking about the questions that are here. And here's how we need to do that, right? We got to be interrogating our theologies in a regular way, right? Those of us who went to seminary more recently or less recently, y'all, we got to take ourselves back to school sometimes, because this theology work has continued to evolve and continue to develop. And boy, everybody thought that Paul Tillich had everything figured out, a generation ago when folks were coming through. And it turns out Paul Tillich did not have everything figured out. And he had some stuff that was really not figured out at all. And guess what? It's a wonderful thing, because some folks have kept working on those projects. And so we need to keep reading, and we need to keep engaging in learning communities to be able to develop ourselves in this kind of way. One of the things that you see noted there is talking about grief. And grief is always coming up. And I think if our faith communities could be about anything, if we could do anything well and uniquely well, it would be, how can we be attending to, caring for, and accompanying grief in all of its forms, in all of its permutations? Because y'all, sometimes grief comes out like rage. Sometimes grief comes out like depression, right? Sometimes grief comes out like substance use. Sometimes grief comes out like divorce. And in all of those kinds of things, we're going to see all of that in our community. Do we recognize the way that grief is complicated in all of those things? I promise you there's going to be some grief after this pandemic. There's going to be the grief of the lives that we've lost, of the jobs that have been lost, of the way in which this nation has already been enduring an enormous grief when it comes to certain ideas about itself that have been utterly destroyed by this presidential administration. I mean, folks are not used to, they are not accustomed to an America that has this president's stink all over it. There is grief that is happening in the midst of that. And as I say, that grief has come out in some different ways, but our faith communities need to be prepared and need to be ready and able to be doing that work. We're going to do it through liturgy. We're going to do it through ritual, but we're going to do it in our bodies. We're going to do it in the way that we show up for each other and that we show ourselves to be resilient in relationship with each other, which is going to indicate to one another, this is a place where we can grieve together. This is a place ultimately where we can grow together too.
That is awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Zachary Moon, for the richness of the presentation. And just to say, I put it in the chat and in the Q&A section. Thank you for your questions and your comments. And we will have a question and answer period after each of the 3 presentations at one time. We'll do all the question and answer at that time. I am really struck by the sharing of hope amid frustration. We're more awake. And so your presentation speaks to the journey of it, and that while the pandemics bring us to the attention of all that is rising to the surface, it's always been there, and it's part of our journey. And the call, if I can use that language, for all faith communities and persons of whatever our traditions, our religious traditions, to live more fully into that. So we're coming back to that because we got some questions for you already. Next, we are pleased to hear from Dorian Ortega, founder of Fly Radical Therapy, come and share some practical tools for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad to be welcome back. And thank you, Zachary. Again, you know, this phase description and the way that we can define phases of disaster really is a helpful way to understand where we are individually and as part of a community. And something that stuck out right away from me was recognizing, you know, when there's a call to the church or the institutions of a church or students that are learning about their faith and how liberation is part of that process. What stuck out to me the most is what I'll transition to is recognizing the privilege is really important when we're doing this work. Recognizing privilege from the individual, but also from the institution. And the church is an institution that has privilege. The Christian faith has privilege. There is this sense of understanding that needs to happen during this awakening period that lots of folks are going through, and really going through phases of their cycles of social liberation and awareness, and feeling like they need to contribute, or feeling like they don't know how to contribute, or feeling the guilt of having privilege is real. And part of the therapeutic approach that I practice with Fly Radical Therapy, the fly part stands for first love yourself. And that is really critical, especially for people of color, for Black, Indigenous people of color. There needs to be a sense of how is it that this country has perfected anti-Blackness. There has been a precision put in place in the United States to very intentionally and precisely and carefully make sure that there is a sentiment and exclusion of the concept of Blackness, and a highlight and a very much power dynamic in play for what whiteness is. And I think it's important for us to understand those concepts, because when we're thinking about charging ourselves, we need to check ourselves, and we need to check our privileges, and we need to understand where we're coming from and where we're speaking from. Because many times what the Christian church has historically done is be in that heroic phase, which doesn't create sustainability. And the church has done this because of their call to make sure that they're ready to receive about privilege and about recognizing the privilege of the church, and the uncomfortable conversations when we think about history and when we think about the impact that it's had on individuals, and how they think of themselves and what they think they need to do. And so I'm gonna just share my screen just to show a little bit about the impact of systemic oppression that plays on the individual, just so that you can see how important it is to, as a therapist, as a clinical therapist, how important it is to understand the systems in place that impact the individual. And I encourage seminarians and faith leaders to also consider these things when speaking from especially a faith lens. And so I'll share my screen here to show this picture of the Bronfenbrenner model, which is the ecological systems model. And you see here, we are the individuals. I think you spoke, Zachary, like, you know, we write our own stories. We are the center of our own universe. You know, we are the ones that are in some way, you know, have some autonomy on learning and choosing how we're going to proceed. And when we build this awareness and understanding of how systems in place has impacted us, I think it gives us more information on how we can move forward and our responsibility of what we're capable of, right? And I want to keep in mind the capacity. Capacity is really critical to consider when we are thinking about what to do next. What is the next step? We have to consider the capacity that not only the individual has, but our community and who we're asking to be a part of this. There's lots of opportunity to engage in so many different ways, and there's a variety of ways to involve yourself in how the change is going to happen for the future. All of that sounds awesome, but when it's not happening inside, it doesn't do much for the role and their the impact that systems in place, such as families, such as the church, right? Their peers, the health service sector, and the big point of making men understanding that there is how racism and discrimination
Dorian, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You are breaking up.
out in our country that their needs. Myself really quick, just to
We understand that Dorian was breaking up just a little bit, and so while she's regrouping to come back.
Am I sounding better?
That's better.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
I'm gonna not move. So I say what I was mentioning, how important it is to understand the systems that are in place, and I kind of moved. I'm going to just go and encourage folks to understand the Bronfenbrenner model of the ecological systems in place, because I think it is important as folks understand how they can be impactful, how important it is to do the individual work first, and how important it is to assess and analyze your own privilege and recognize where you're speaking from. And how it is that we can understand capacity. And I'm not sure if that got cut in or got cut out, but capacity is really important to understand here. Some folks have capacity or maybe overwhelm themselves because of their experiences when we really want to think about restoration, and when we really want to think about reconstructing, we really need to consider capacity building. And how it is that not only are we as people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, are caring for themselves, are really, working on this way of caring, of considering their well-being, and their capacity to perform or engage and build while they're doing that needs to also engage with people of power that are in place, right? There needs to be this accountability of folks in power and in place to be able to create these space, right? And hold themselves accountable for the continuing cycles that that people of color continue to be affected by. I want to just make a note that during Dr. Moon's disaster phase, when you spoke on time, I really couldn't help as a clinician to consider how some of these phases are in line with domestic violence, and how the domestic violence perpetuates the cycle of power and control. And when we think about people of color, we have to understand that there's, as faith leaders, as clinicians, as therapists or social workers, most of us are dealing with helping the individual heal from a trauma they've experienced. We're working as for people who are dealing with the aftermath and the side effects of this power and control system that we're living in. And so last time we spoke a little bit about how folks are dealing with this post-traumatic stress, or post-traumatic slave syndrome was mentioned. If folks want to also encourage that study as well. But where is the accountability for focusing on racism as a mental illness? There isn't really a lot of discussion about racism being an illness. Where's the accountability there? And so we need to have these discussions and also understand that part of the action steps need to include discussions about a community accountability. And so I have this slide up to talk about Hodona healing. And Hodona is a Spanish word for, it's not really the nicest word. It's like equivalent to the B word in English. And it's really is the agitator. So Hodona healing is just talking about the agitator, the one that is always angry and talking and loud, right? We spoke about rage, right? And how important it is to identify rage as a healthy emotion that moves and shapes and changes things when it's channeled in a healthy way. And so anger is a very healthy emotion, and people should be angry about what's happening. And when we're not, we're really starting to understand the illness, the psychological impact and illness that we're seeing for folks who are not trying to see what's happening or not trying to get involved. And there has to be this understanding that that's also something that we need to be peculiar about. So Hodona healing looks like this in the following ways in terms of engaging in a very genuine way with community and with ourselves. Again, I focus back on the individual, right? If you're not individually taking care of yourself, you can do more harm than good. So really consider how you're managing your well-being as an individual, and maybe consider your capacity. And if you're not, you're in a place where you need to take care of yourself, then maybe another person could take on some of these things that might have capacity. So really being considerate of our egos and our ethos. Our ethos are our integral value systems, our morals, our beliefs, right? And most of us believe that we want the world to be a better place. It doesn't always have to be us to save it. So we need to be mindful about how we're creating communities in intentional ways and building capacities in intentional ways. So here I have some examples of some of the ways that I have learned how to engage as a community mental health worker. And so one of the things that I've encouraged folks to do, and that what I've seen, is creating safe spaces. Safe spaces to actually have uncomfortable discussions and facilitating them in a safe way, and having restorative justice be talked about as a practice and a consistent discussion. And when you create safe spaces, there needs to be settings of agreement and boundaries. There needs to be a recognition that if we are going to have discussions and restoration discussions, we need to also recognize that the uncomfortability of what folks, the discomfort that folks might feel in some of these discussions when someone recognizes their privilege. How is it that they're able to move through those feelings in a healthy way without creating more shame and blame? And so when we set agreements and boundaries, we're setting up understandings about how it is that we need to move and understand each other and communicate with each other in a way that's going to be helpful and healthy and not create more barriers. The discussions of systemic oppression needs to happen. It's really deep rooted here in the United States. Again, anti-Blackness is the norm here. It's been perfected here in the United States in ways that it hasn't in other countries. It's real here. And so the work needs to really highlight that reality because it's so deeply rooted and so deeply embedded. How are we collectively, working together as community, not only using our personal experiences, because I think when we talk in safe spaces and we utilize our own stories, that's helpful, and storytelling is really a helpful way for us to understand each other. But sometimes it could limit our capacity. So when we're working just on stories and individual stories, and we're not including factual or evidence-based, studies in our approaches, we may miss the mark, right? We need to also understand that individual stories are important to hear. However, we need to also share the facts and the evidence that's also a part of this process, and understand the studies that are happening, that are going, in terms of our world and where it's going, and the healthiness of the environment. We need to really understand the impact that this has. And so when you mention about epigenetics, I right away thought of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? There has been studies to show that the brain literally changes after experiences a traumatic event. So imagine living in a community where there's chronic violence and disparity, what that does to the brain and its capacity to learn or process information. We have to really have these real biological study understandings of the impact that oppression has had on the individual, and why certain individuals continue to have certain disparities. There's something happening on a very, macro system or systemic level. And I spoke last also about reawakening the roots and encouraging, as again, understanding that the faith-based practice or Christianity has had this privilege in the world. How is it that we're encouraging folks to understand their roots and their cultural their cultural upbringing, and how is that respected? How is it respected, right? One, and acknowledged, but also how is it utilized for healing as well? Many folks of color come from very rich countries and very rich traditions, and there should be an inclusion, an intersection of those conversations when we're thinking about the healing and restoration process. Taking up space is important for people of color, especially. There's not always seats at the table. And so sometimes there needs to be, somebody needs to bring their own chair, or there needs to be this movement of taking up space or creating space for folks who experience more privilege. How are they creating and opening doors for individuals who are marginalized typically? And how are we allowing that voice to be heard? I have an example here of creating a monthly poetry healing circles. That's just healing circles and peace circles are things that really help to promote restoration and promote safety and bravery. And so an example of something I've done was creating poetic justice healing circles. These are just something free for the community that happens on a consistent basis, and creating consistency and community care. Compassionate care can be a really beautiful way to help us be guided through this struggle, because the struggle is real. We are going to continue to deal with very deep embedded issues in the society that we are not always able to control and really figure all out at the same time. And so I just want to end with a beautiful just quote by Angela Davis, like thinking about things, changing things that I can't accept. There's just this commitment that we need to have about changing things that we can no longer accept. And so I just want to end with that quote and just encourage folks to really engage in this dialogue with us, and ask any questions.
Thank you so much, Dorian, and thank all of you who are noting questions in the Q&A and as well as the chat. We will attend to those after Dr. Crumpton's presentation. But I do want to say, Dorian, what I'm struck by is in part the emphasis on capacity building, that it's not only individual, it's a collective and even an institutional need, if I can put it that way, and the ways in which we can do that as institutions. So we look forward to sharing the questions with you in a few minutes. But first, Dr. Stephanie, would you share your presentation and help us focus on even more the spiritually engagement that's needed in this work?
I really appreciate what Dorian and Zachary have shared so far. A couple of things that have stood out to me that actually kind of roll over into what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, when we're thinking about the long haul of trauma preparedness, to recognize that we are in a long haul that is part of a longer haul, right? And so the commitment to being aware of the transgenerational nature of what we're dealing with, that there's transgenerational trauma, but there's also transgenerational resilience, right? And transgenerational resistance and capacity that is also being handed down. And also, and part of that is being aware, right? As Dorian really helped us see with that graphic, being aware of the systems that are in place that impact individuals, right? And again, these systems are nothing new, as Dorian said. They're nothing new, but they're also nothing new to those who came before us and who are also a part of who we are now, right? So this intergenerational piece, I think, is pretty important. And before I go any further, I want us to do the thing that I think helps us tap into some of what we have stepped into. Last time when we talked, I mentioned the importance of noticing that as we do care, we are stepping into a transgenerational tide, a legacy of care providers who have been coming before us. And we are not alone as we step into this movement. And the movement looks different. There are several movements, but I think, first of all, the will to care The will to notice that people are hurting and the will to step up and to provide care is a movement. And then the will to be socially engaged as you're doing care, because it's one thing to want to ease someone's pain and suffering right then and there with a tissue and solace. It's another thing to support someone's healing and healing through resistance by naming, right, the systems that may be in play that are negatively impacting, that are in some ways making the situation worse, right? One of the key things that we can do is to remember that we don't just experience these things cognitively, but we experience them in our bodies. This is a body experience, right? The memories are embodied, for good or bad. The hope, the possibility is embodied. So for just a few moments, I'd like for us to begin this portion by stepping back for a minute. For those who are comfortable, I would invite you to, if there's something in front of you, move it aside. If you have something in your hands, if you're comfortable, make some space for yourself. For those who are comfortable, I invite you to close your eyes. If you want to keep your eyes open, I invite you to notice a fixed point in the room. And I want us to begin just for a second to breathe together. To simply stop in the time that we have committed to be together right now, to simply stop for a moment and to breathe. Breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. Continue that breathing. And I'm going to ask you, as you continue to feel the oxygen in your body, remember with your mind and with your body a time when you felt creative, a time when you felt imaginative, when possibility was real for you. Now I encourage you to remember in your breath and in your body what it feels like to be heard, to be seen, to be understood and respected. So feel the creativity, the possibility, what it is to be genuinely seen, heard, felt, and respected. And I also ask you this final prompt. Think of your ancestors. They may be a part of your bloodline, whom you know personally, or they may be a part of what we sometimes call the great cloud of witnesses, those that you may have read their work, you may have seen their art, you may have read about their lives, you may have listened to their music, you may have watched them perform. Think of an ancestor who inspires you. Think of an ancestor. Think of that warmth. Remember, recall, reclaim. Remember, recall, reclaim that feeling of being unalone. I invite you to continue breathing, and as you are comfortable, begin to blink your eyes open. I wanted to start this portion of our work with a reminder of what it is to be human. To be human is to be in connection. To be human is to exist and to know that you exist because people see you, hear you, respect your humanity. One of the things that has become most important for me as a spiritual leader, doing healing supportive work with activists, organizers, or anybody who dares to be awake, is the importance of taking care of ourselves while we're doing care with others. And the reason why I focus on breath work and bodies and our humanity is because when we encounter and we push against oppression, when we push against injustice, it's an act that we experience in our bodies, and we carry the memory of that encounter. We carry what it feels like to hit against strong systems that are relentless, right? We carry that in our bodies, but just like we carry that in our bodies and the memory of that in our bodies from those who came before us, we also carry, and I love this, let's see if I can get this up here. I love that not only do we carry the memory of what it feels like to actually run into hard things, we also carry with us healing, right? This is one of my favorite memes. I asked us to remember what it feels like to be possible and creative and imaginative, and to be felt, seen, and heard, and to be unalone, because it is the memory that sustains us. It is the memory of being well. It was the memory of having possibility that could become something real. It is the memory, right, of being respected that keeps us going. It's not just the memory of being denigrated. It's not just the memory of being murdered. It's not just the memory of injustice, because those are all things that take away life. That is not enough to keep us going. It's enough to start us, right, and get us into that heroic phase that Zach discussed, right? But it's not enough to sustain us. It's the memory of the life-giving, healing wisdom in our bodies that we have to call on in embodied practices like breathing, right? And one of the things I'm really working with right now, personally, but also with others with whom I'm providing support, in this moment where, again, we have seen, let's see, we had Eric Garner, who was killed, and his last words were, "I can't breathe." Now we had COVID worldwide, literally taking people's breath away. And then now, again, we have George Floyd, again, "I can't breathe." The reality and those memories are so powerful, but here's the deal. We must breathe. I understand that it's common, and it is an act of solidarity for us to often display in our social media accounts also, "I can't breathe," when we see someone dying in this way. But here's the thing, we must breathe. Breathing is an act of resistance, right? Most of the time we seem to think that resistance only looks a certain way, but claiming the healing force within us is an act of resistance. And it is a spiritual work, right, that requires that we go deep within, right, to remember moments when we have been healed. And not just us, but those around us have been healed. People who have experienced marginalization and injustice are not only the marginalized and those who have been unjustly harmed. They are human beings who possess resistance, who possess resilience, and also who possess dreams, who possess a will to love. That is the healing balm that is in our DNA that allows us to keep pushing even when we are facing death, even when we have been killed. You can kill the body, but you cannot kill the spirit. You see, the spirit is going to make its way up out that body down into the next generation some kind of way. And so one of the things I think it's important for us to think about is, as much as we are dealing with trauma, the long haul view has got to also keep an eye on the healing that is within us individually and collectively. Memory, if trauma can be passed down through generations, if that is true, then so can healing be passed down through generations, right? And it is that, and I want us to think about healing in a more organic an egalitarian way. It is not just in the hand of the professional or the leader or the pastor, the priest, the imam, right? It is not just the identified leader. The healing is happening in kitchens when we remember recipes and we gather together. The healing is happening when we take our hands. I have been gardening. I mean, hands down. I mean, I have bought gardening equipment. I have farm equipment at my house in the city because I have been digging in the dirt. And what I recognize is that that was part of my healing because it connected me to my grandfathers who gardened. And these were two men who were in the military during times that it was probably unfathomable for them to have had the success that they did. There is something in our bones that is just as powerful, if not more so, than the trauma. So to remember the healing that is within us. The second thing I want us to think about also is not only remember it, because remembering can be an individual act, but it also needs to be a collective act, right? What and or who helps you remember what you know to be true about the possibilities of life? We cannot afford during this time when we have to have a short-term response with a long-term view, right? You have to manage the short-term immediate and also keep an eye on a view to the future around reconstruction that Dr. Moon was talking about. We cannot forget that we have to be held accountable to remember possibility. Now, I want to make a distinction between possibility and hope, because you can get into a little bit of trouble here, right? When folks are in the middle of resistance, they're like, don't talk to me about hope. And I actually respect that, right? But what I do want to talk about is possibility. And possibility, we believe in possibility because we already have had experiences when we've been possible. That's why I asked you, remember a time when you were creative. Remember a time when you felt what it was to be possible. Who and what can help you remember what you know to be true about possibility, keeping people around you and having practices, things that you actually do, right? So that you can embody the memory now, which then creates a new memory, by the way. So memory. The next thing I want us to think about is commitment. And I get this quote that's here listed for those who are listening and who can't see it. This will be shared with the additional resources. This comes from Charlene Carruthers, who was one of the co-founders of Black Youth Project 100 here in Chicago. She wrote a book, an amazing book after her time, reflecting on what it means to prepare for leadership and movement work, Unapologetic, a Black, queer, and feminist mandate for radical movements. She stresses the importance of principled struggle. So we all have struggles, but it's the way that you go about it that makes the difference, right? And she says that struggle without principles to practice and uphold leads to breakdowns and conflict, in some cases, death. So struggle, if we're going to have a long haul approach, we have to think about what is important to us, what do we hold near and dear as values, communal values, that help us determine how we're going to engage the struggle. Struggle is inevitable. The question is, how are we going to get into the struggle so that we make it out whole on the other side of it, right? And so she talks about how to define what principled struggle is. She talks about principled struggle means that we talk with each other from a place that allows mutual dignity, which is why I started again with what it means to be human. It's easy to tear apart somebody if you don't see them as a human being who is equally created in the image of God, just as you are. Now, let me be very clear. That ain't easy. There are some people I genuinely do not like. I couldn't even get it out all the way right then clearly. There are some people I really don't like. I'm very clear about it. I have no willingness to become different about my dislike about them. But the line for me is that I'm not going to treat you as if you are not human, even if you're trying to treat me that way and also behaving yourself as if you are not human, right? And that's real important, right? When you get into conflict, right? And Zach, we talked a little bit about this before, and so did you too, Dorian, when you were talking about recognizing privilege. we have to have some baseline values, right? That are non-negotiable, right? Because we have to think about this. It's easy to bond and get together and be heroes together, as you mentioned, Zach. But when it talks about the long haul, we got to talk about building something. And building is full of false starts, disappointments, success, stuff falling apart. We missed a screw in the foundation. There's going to be a rupture, not to mention we're also carrying our own traumas that both Dorian and Zach talked about. So you bring it with you. One day it might be a good day. Another day it's not so great. But the question is, what are the lines in the sand that we have decided we're not going to cross when we run into each other, perhaps both on a bad day? And the line that Charlene Carruthers is drawing is around mutual dignity. We talk with each other from a place that allows mutual dignity. And finally, Charlene talks about principal struggle means that our conclusions about people, events, and organizations are as sound as possible, grounded in observation, and recognizing that even then our assessment may not be valid. Sometimes we don't see the whole picture. We don't have all the information, and we just don't have a full picture of it. And we're not just plain blank, we're wrong. It happens, right? It just is what it is. But the question is, are we committing together to finding out what the full story is, right? Even when the full story might expose our part in the predicament. Because sometimes when we get pieces of the story, it allows us to make the other person. And let me be clear, when I say other, I'm not talking about the people that we might be fighting against out there. I'm talking about as institutions develop, as organizations start to coalesce, as friendships start to form, people that with whom we have affinity and affection. I'm talking about the people we want to hold close. I'm not talking about people we can't stand. I'm talking about people we like, right? Can we commit to learning some more about the situation, and can we risk being shown for our full humanity, which is full of flaws and full of greatness, right? Can we ground ourselves in observation, which I love here, rather than judgment? And so these are the three things she outlines here around principled struggle. And I want us to think about commitment to principled struggle. So this is kind of these are things to be mindful of, but how do you do that, right? And one of the things that I wanted us to think about here is, when do you gather with others to share and recommit to your highest and best values? Because it's one thing to say we have these commitments, right? And to maybe recall them when somebody's out of line. You know, it's easy. We always want to pull up the rules, right? When somebody's acting out. But my question is, when with regularity are you committing to a spiritual practice of gathering to share and recommit to your highest and best values? Now, recommit suggests that maybe you fell off. And I'm okay with that. We're human. We're going to have moments where we did not step up to what we said was most important to us. And it wasn't because we don't mean it. It just means that we're what? Human. But you also have to have people who can hold you accountable to that, right? And so not only when do you gather with others to share and recommit, and share when you are not where you want to be, but how often and with whom, right? Who loves you enough to tell you the truth in love, right? And who do you trust enough that when you don't like what they're saying, you will still require that they hold you accountable to what you said was important? Now, I said it real strong, had my little finger pointing out, and I'm shaking my head, and I mean it, but it's the worst feeling in the world when someone you love has to pull your coat. And thank God for them, right? I have a good girlfriend of mine, and we laugh and we say, oh, you done pulled up something, you got our relationship hanging in the balance. We don't know if we're going to make it. We out here in the balance, right? But the importance of making solid commitments for the long haul, which requires a lot of truth, a lot of vulnerability, being willing to be vulnerable and willing to hold a space to see someone be vulnerable, which is tough because we often require that our leaders mold them, and we require that they be molded for the heroic phase. right? So they have to be strong and tough and heroic and ready to get, but what Zach and Dorian are helping us to see is that that's a part of what it is to be human. The rest of the self is not only heroic, the rest of the self is vulnerable. The rest of the self can be unsure. The rest of the self, the hero ain't got time to be asking questions. Hero's like, we got to get this done. The rest of the leader is going to have to commit to asking questions about themselves and others, because remember, one of the principles was mutual dignity. One of the principles was observation, right? So commitment. And this final one is reclamation. Now this is I'm struggling with this one myself. Let me just say, Howard Thurman, I call on him and I ask for his strong hand, his ancestral hand. You see, I'm gripping the top of my dress, but I do believe in this. Howard Thurman writes, it may be that you feel you have a right to be out of harmony because you know you have never done to anybody what was done to you. Yet you must find a way to love your enemy if you want to be whole. Not if you want to redeem your enemy, but because you want to be whole. A part of you is caught in the deed, which he or she has done, and you must get you out of it to restore wholeness to yourself. Friends, saints, beloveds, I just need you to know that I am walking along the way with this one. I am not there. It is aspirational for me. And so because it is aspirational, and my guess is that it is aspirational because there's something in me that believes it to be true, right? But I'm walking in the way of the Lord with this one. Have to be real saved with that one because I need some help. And I think that some of these questions here might help us to name the part of ourselves that got locked up in the deed or the trespass. I'm not talking about the other person, but to name the part of me, what got locked up in the transgression, in the betrayal, in the disrespect, in the injustice, in the hurt, harm, and violence and violation. What part, not what did the other person do? That's important. But for the sake of our own wholeness, what got locked up? What did the deed separate us away from within ourselves? And then, so first to name it, what got locked up? I didn't say what got lost. I'm talking about what got locked up. Lost means something is gone. Locked up means there's something still alive and vibrant, but is in some ways in a carceral experience. What practices, relationships, boundaries, and new experiences can we pursue for our own emancipation? So none of this has to do with focusing on the other person. It's about naming the part of ourselves that is still alive yet incarcerated, and then being an agent in our own liberation. But this is work that has to have commitment to it. It don't just happen overnight. And it doesn't just, I believe in prayer. There's prayer that we sit still and do and listen. And then there's the prayer of action called a moving meditation, which means seeking new relationships that support the freedom of the self that got locked up, and setting boundaries. And boundaries are critical for relationships that are built for the long haul. Setting boundaries that will allow the part of the self that has been locked up, as that part, as that she, as that he, as that they becomes free. Boundaries that keep those that don't support life on the other side, as this self becomes anew and begins to revive itself and seeks out new experiences that support and affirm the wholeness of the part that had been locked up. So again, memory, the role of memory. We may hold trauma, but that is not all that we hold. We hold healing. We hold individual capacity and collective capacity to heal ourselves and others together. We also have to be committed, right? Committed to sharing our most and best, highest values that will hold us and determine how we approach principled struggle and reclamation. Going to get the part of oneself that got locked up, to emancipate oneself. And to emancipate oneself is also to offer a roadmap for freedom for others that with whom we share community, right? And so these are the three things I have to offer as we talk about a spirituality for the long haul. Now, no, I didn't quote scripture, right? I didn't say Jesus every other word. I didn't say God every other word, but I also have a view of what it is to be human, and to be human is to be animated by the spirit of God's life, right? And so all of that then makes all of that spiritual for me. And so that's what I kind of want to offer when we think about the long haul work of community building and collective living through traumatic seasons, right? The seasons we're recalling from the past and that are compounding right now, the pandemic within the pandemic, and the reality that every day when we get up and look at the news, even though we might be making our way, it may feel like we're making our way towards reconstruction. God only knows what could happen, that we find something on social media that snaps us right back, right? To the very beginning of the chart that Zach showed us. And because there's an awareness that something can always happen. And unfortunately, we live among systems that in some ways thrive off of the fear of something always happening. So that's what I have to offer for thinking about thinking spiritually about trauma, thinking spiritually about accountability and commitment, and that we have the capacity within and among ourselves to be well, even as we fight.
Yes. And so, Dr. Crumpton, I want to say thank you. This thing of remembering, and each of you presenters have connected the dots in similar ways, and even with the distinctives, and this thing of remembering that they're the healing force within us. And also I've heard from you, as well as our other two presenters, it is both, and it is that continuation of internal awareness, understanding, growth, development, and our commitment to that for ourselves, but also our spheres of influence, whatever those institutions that we are working and serving in, the collective movement. So I want to thank you. We do have some questions that we're going to try to attend to in the next 15 minutes. As a reminder, all of the presentations and resources shared with us today will be posted on both McCormick Seminary's website and Chicago Presbytery's website, and also our YouTube channel as well. So Dr. Zachary, there was a question early on for you. Could you say more about epigenetics? Give maybe a 1 minute short view of what is epigenetics. And then secondly, could you say a little bit about the heroic phase and how sheltering in place, you mentioned, and or whatever our roles are in that heroic phase, is there anything that we can take from that phase that might help us build resilience as we move toward disillusionment and reconstruction? So.
Right. So there's a lot to be said about epigenetics, and the other two panelists can certainly add to this. For those of us who work with people, I think epigenetics is one of the most fascinating things to come along in a great long while. And it's one of those places where we're reminded that the work of science and the work of faith aren't really strangers to each other. Epigenetics is a scientifically robust exploration, and yet it also speaks to some of what many traditions and many communities have known for a long time. When folks who talk about ancestors are talking about epigenetics, they're talking about exactly what Dr. Crumpton alluded to just a little while ago, of saying this this trauma that we carry in our bodies, and there's also great power that we carry in our bodies. That it's not just the specter of horrors and hauntings from the past, but it is also a deep resolve to survive, even in the face of the most daunting and death-dealing of circumstances. Bessel van der Kolk's book was already mentioned, I think, by Dorian, The Body Keeps Score. That's a phenomenal text if you're interested in this a little bit. So much of this kind of the conversation of epigenetics emerges through trauma studies, right? How do we understand trauma in bodies, particularly in relationship to trauma, but recognizing, so you've heard a number of us kind of talk about transgenerational. What epigenetics is helping us to acknowledge and more fully appreciate is that, again, beyond a sort of conscious understanding of things that may have happened to us or may have happened in our family of origin, that at a DNA level of our bodiness, there are stories and there are experiences that are inscribed there. The other book that I think at this point ought to be recommended, if not required reading for us, is My Grandmother's Hands. And I can put that in the chat box as well. Again, certainly speaks to epigenetics, but one of the things that's quite extraordinary in that book is some differentiation between the legacy of what has been targeted to Black bodies in this context, and differentiating that from what has been inscribed and influenced and informed white bodies in that space. And then beyond that, actually thinking about a sort of third community of police bodies within this space. So as we're thinking about issues of policing, surveillance, law and order, for what that verbiage is being used now, coded language in certain kind of ideologies. This book is an extraordinary entry point into it, and not just at an analysis level, but also very much on a kind of workbook level. There's practices that are suggested there, and opportunities for the readers to really take hold of this at a body level. I would like to pause here and see if either of these other two panelists just want to add to any of the epigenetics piece before we try to pick up that second question, Barbara.
I don't know if I would add anything else other than, making note about how it can be. So there was this kind of sentiment of like expectations that there's these pre-existing conditions and predispositions, which can influence this dialogue or discourse about certain races being in certain categories or exposed to certain, illnesses. So it's uncomfortable to like study epigenetics in that way. What I also would add is that I'm glad there are now studies and research that are proving the way that trauma has impacted the brain, which I'm not sure how much. I mean, I'm sure that relates, but I can share very honestly. I'm fairly young. I studied psychology and graduated in 2009. And I remember taking a cognitive psychology course in 2009, right? So this is, not too long ago, 10 years ago. And I remember asking my professor about whether or not different cultures process information differently. And I was told that no, because we all have the same brain and it functions in the way that the brain is supposed to function. Now, within the past 5 to 7 years, we're seeing evidence about the brain that show different, that show that certain communities do process information differently in terms of learning. Like, for example, children, Black and brown children who may live in impoverished areas with low resource attainability, the brain looks different. It processes information in a different way. And what kind of implications do you think that has for the classroom, for the resources in the community, for access to resources, right? And how that child or how those children are being cared for and how their learning experiences are going to look like. So this really, again, uncomfortable conversations about how it is that we have as a society missed a lot of information, and missed, and how certain resources have been distributed in specific communities to really help continue to foster a systemic problem.
I have nothing to add. You all were magnificent.
Barbara, then picking up the question about sheltering in place, I mean, there's so many layers to this, and I hope for all of us, we're finding the relationships in the communities to really ask that very question, because I think for all of us, the unfamiliarity that for many of us have experienced in the kind of shelter in place, the confines of that, there's been some uniqueness, there's been some unfamiliarity, there's been some discomfort. Some of it has felt very dangerous and threatening. I think some of it has been very morally distressing as we have tried to navigate the moral dimensions of when to go where, and seeing other people make other choices, and recognizing the moral dimensions of public health in the midst of all of that, that this is a shared collective reality. I mean, as really so much of reality is, and yet I think the pandemic has just framed that so clearly for us. And yet many people have continued to perpetuate a kind of overestimation of their individual freedom at the expense of our collective and communal freedom and well-being in this time. So I think there are a number of questions that this shelter in place dynamic have certainly elevated potentially for us in this conversation. We were talking about being the center of our own universe, and that's necessary, and also sometimes a little bit of a dilemma for us. I think one of the things that I have spent a lot of time thinking about in the midst of sheltering in place is the religious traditions around Sabbath taking, and how that was always very spiritualized in my faith tradition. You know, that we talked about Sabbath and the need for rest, and you know, self-care was kind of attached into there. You know, some different images of that. But always very spiritualized, and as far as it was spiritualized, it was consistently optional. You know, it was like, remember to take that Sabbath. You know, remember, don't be at the grind every hour of every day. You know, I mean, and in that way, it became aspirational, and it became certainly optional as far as that went. And working with, you know, training religious leaders in the seminary, you know, always trying to have that conversation, but always recognizing that people were really caught in between this culture around productivity and around really kind of, you know, always trying to creep up to the edge of burning oneself out. And that being seen, this is part of the kind of heroic energy too. You know, it's like, if I can't tell you how almost burned out I am, you know, I don't know what I'm, you know, I might be saying I'm not tough, or I'm not working hard, or I'm not earning that paycheck, or I'm not, you know, befitting of this title, or, you know, and all these kind of projections going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Well, this shelter in place thing, I mean, this is like Sabbath taking itself, you know, whether or not it is ever going to cease to be aspirational or optional for us. And there are so many things that have been costly about this, and certainly the human cost has been immense on so many levels. And yet I also hear scientists talking about how holes in the ozone layer are healing itself because folks have just stopped jumping in their car every 5 seconds to sit in traffic somewhere. And I hear that and I think to myself, there are many layers to what's happening here. And that which we have been navigating on a day-to-day basis, that which has been unfamiliar and discomforting and at times life-limiting to us, all of those challenges are very real on a personal, interpersonal, you know, community level. I understand all of that is certainly, we're contending with a great deal of loss and grief as much as that goes. And I'm also aware that when I get out of my house now, all those other creatures, those squirrels and those birds, it's like they took over the earth again, you know? And I'm not walking down my street anymore. I'm walking down their street now, you know? And they're looking at me like, should you be here right now? You know, and there's something about that, I don't know, it swells my heart a little bit, because it's reminding me of some things that I think are there within our religious tradition about Sabbath, about if you don't take a break, the earth is not going to get to reclaim and repair and replenish in the ways that it needs to. And it feels like this has put some things back in order, even in the midst of everything that has been quite difficult about this, that maybe we were never going to sort of fully do for ourselves.
Wow, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question, and we apologize that the time does run out, but the conversation is so rich and the resources will be available to all of us to continue the conversation and see what we might practice and apply. But the last question I have for Dorian, because this was named quite a while ago, I'm wondering, the question, the person says, if you might explain further what is meant by the concept of racism as a mental illness.
Good question. Well, I just want to say that how important it is to hold accountability, and I think that racism as a mental illness would hold accountability to the power dynamics and oppressor that has been, you know, put in place, and that we live in this particular system that values a power and control dynamic. And when we think about terrorism, when we think about how KKK still exists in our society as something that is okay, or something that's not being dismantled in any particular ways, much like the Al-Qaeda was, we have to consider what kind of instability mentally and psychologically do those values and belief systems of terror and how that affects folks, right? There's this way of how we as a society want to heal the issue or the wound, but we aren't talking about the person or the people that did the hurt, right? The bullies, the folks that are the perpetrators. So where is the room for the perpetrators in these discussions on healing? Where is the accountability for the perpetrators who continue to abuse their powers? Why are we talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome and not talking about racism as a mental illness? That's what I mean about racism as a mental illness, as almost equivalent to narcissism or social pathology. Why aren't we having those conversations about racism as a social pathology? These are uncomfortable conversations because that means that institutions of power that have perpetuated these cycles will have to hold themselves accountable for being a part of it. And so that's what I mean when I say that.
Thank you so much with the clarity that brings. I'd like to give Dr. Stephanie the last words, and in the chat, I will post now the next, our next webinar is July 16th, and those of you who registered for this webinar, you will receive an email to share with your networks, and we hope you will join us. I want to thank all three presenters. It has been phenomenal. And Dr. Stephanie, would you have the last words, please?
Yeah, I have a last word that is a collective word, which is a word of thanks and gratitude for this brave conversation. There have been some very powerful things that have been said without flinching. And this is without flinching, but also with a sense of compassion and understanding, right? Which are some of the things that we've been talking about. If we're going to get into, let alone survive through the Reconstruction phase, we got to tell the truth, right? But not in this kind of social media mediated cancel culture, tell the truth, but in a kind of truth telling that brings people in and that has space to breathe even through the hard parts. And so I really appreciate Dorian and Zach, and also Barbara, you for your questions or pulling us together, and that this would be a part of what it takes to move, build the foundation for Reconstruction. I also appreciate everyone who continues to join us. We understand that there are those of us who are on the screen, but you all are a part of the building of the foundation. And I just want to remind us all that we are part of a long-standing tradition of people who are committed to wellness. And I can't understate or overstate that enough for us to remember that we come from somewhere and we're headed somewhere. And so I'll close with that. We come from somewhere and we're headed somewhere. We'll see you all on July 16th. I think I can go ahead and announce that the theme for that one is called NUMB, N-U-M-B, NUMB, when trauma changes you, right? Because it's really important for us to recognize that we're surviving and we're getting through this, but something is happening, right? And there may be some moments where we seem foreign to ourselves because something has happened to us. And so how do we get through that? And so a friend of mine always jokes with me and says, I'll lean back and say something is happening. So we're going to talk about those things that are happening in us individually and collectively. Until then, we will see you all. Please take good care of yourselves. Thank you so much for your interest, energy, and time. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.